Right, we're now at 4 o'clock, so I think it's time to get going with the webinar. We've still got a few people arriving, and so I'll just remind people that there are opportunities to ask questions through this webinar. So if you just use the menu that's on your screen, you should be able to find an option to add some questions. We've got a couple of people who've added those questions already, and that's great. We'll deal with those questions at the end. So what I'll be doing is I'll be talking for about half an hour probably, and then we'll move on and we'll look at some questions. So let's start by thinking a little bit about Gatsby Benchmark 2, which looks at career and labour market information. So this webinar builds on the Careers Leaders Handbook, which hopefully many of you have already got your copy of. But if not, you can buy one from the Tristram website or from Amazon. And the webinars are led by me, Tristram Hooley, and also by my colleague and co-author, David Andrews, who will be leading some of the ones later on in the series. And really, each of these webinars builds on a different chapter from the book. So this one is looking at the chapter that deals with career and labour market information. So this is what I'm going to cover over the next half an hour or so. And so I'm going to start by just reminding people about the Gatsby benchmarks. So I talk about this every week, it seems, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the Gatsby benchmarks came out of some research that we did back in 2013, 2014. And what that research really aimed to do was to draw best practice together in a way that was able to summarize. I've heard a message saying that there's no sound. Let me just pause for a second and see. Hold on a second. I'll be back in just 1 second. Sound is fine. I'm hearing from other people. Thank you very much for people dropping in. Brilliant. Okay. So to return to the Gatsby benchmarks, we had research which in 2014, which summarized what the evidence said and what good practice internationally said about career guidance. And career guidance in this sense is a very broad set of different kinds of things that you can do with young people to help them to think about their future. And in this paper, which is called Good Career Guidance, we presented 8 benchmarks which summarized the evidence on career guidance. And the idea of that was to present it in a way that could be understood by policymakers and acted on by school leaders. And I think it's achieved really very widespread support and now really underpins a lot of the statutory guidance that's available for schools. So as a quick refresher, the 8 Gatsby benchmarks cover these areas. The first one is the idea of a stable careers program. So the idea that you need to organize your provision as a program rather than just as a series of activities. And we covered that in a webinar last week, which you can download now and listen to if you missed that one. The second one, that's what we're dealing with today, is the idea of learning from career and labour market information. So we'll talk about that a bit more in a second. But then the third one, which we'll be looking at next week, is about the importance of addressing the needs of each pupil, of recognizing that career guidance needs to be differentiated to different pupils. Our fourth benchmark looks at curriculum and the importance of linking the subject-based curricula to career learning. Fifth one looks at encounters with employers and employees. And then the sixth one looks at actually giving students experiences of workplaces, including work experience, or traditional work experience. The seventh one then looks at encounters with further and higher education. And our 8th benchmark focuses on personal guidance, which is what people sometimes refer to as career counselling, or career guidance is sometimes used to mean that. But by that we mean a professional encounter between a careers professional and a young person. So this is our 8 Gatsby benchmarks, and this provides the context for what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to focus in on benchmark 2 today. So the first thing is Benchmark 2 is about labour market information, and what it tells us is that information is everywhere. There's an awful lot of information that we can use to underpin our learning about our career. And this information is very useful when it underpins our decision making. So career and labour market information is particularly important because it gives you the knowledge base which allows you to make good decisions. So one of the key aims of a careers program is to ensure that young people have access to the information that they need. So careers and labour market information comes in many forms, and I've included just a few examples on this slide. So we might have labour market information, which would be government statistics produced, perhaps telling us how the economy is doing. Or we might have information that's produced by the media. So, for example, the World University rankings that are produced by the Times Higher Education. And that tells us about which universities are supposedly better than others. And one of the things that we notice even so far is that labour market information can cover both the labour market and it can also cover the learning market, so the education system. So that's really important to note, is that the labour market information is not just about the labour market. However, one of the things that we find most useful is information that's available for people who are applying for jobs. So for example, we've got lots of online job sources that we could go to and do a search for a particular career, and we could find out whether there were any jobs being advertised at the moment in that area. And then finally on here, as a fourth example, I've got a bus timetable. And you might think, well, a bus timetable isn't really what you would normally think of when you're thinking about labour market information. But actually, when you start to think about any kind of job, you need to think about whether it's something that you could actually physically get to. Would I be able to commute to this job or not? So I know when I look at jobs, I'm very interested in what the usually train timetable tells me as to whether it's something that I could feasibly get to within a reasonable amount of time in a day. So labour market information potentially wraps up all of these different kinds of sources. It wraps up government information, information provided by employers, information provided by the media, and other kinds of information that might be relevant to somebody's career choice or occupational choice. So when we're thinking about labour market information, it's very helpful for us to think broadly, I think. So careers programs then should introduce the idea that labour market information exists. Many young people won't be aware of the idea of labour market information. They won't have thought that there's places that they can go and get answers to some of their questions. For example, what qualifications do you need to do this job, or where might I study for these qualifications? Careers programs should also try and draw out some key insights from this information. So where possible, we would try and give information to young people in a form that's actually useful to them. And some people would describe this as being labour market intelligence. So we're not just giving them raw information, we're saying actually this might be particularly useful to you because it would relate to your career journey in this way. Another important area is that we need to teach people the skills that are needed to critically engage with this information, and we'll look at this a bit more later on. And then I think the final point is that we would normally want to focus on these things, particularly prior to any key decision points. So there are a number of moments in the school timetable when people will have to make decisions. So we might choose GCSEs in year 8 or year 9. We would choose A levels probably in year 11. In year 13 we might choose what to do post A levels. And those choices get more complicated still because there are a number of other choices that we potentially can make. So young people can now change schools potentially at 14, go to UTCs or colleges at that point. Again, at 16, there are opportunities to change and to move into more vocational paths as the T levels come online. And then at 18, there are many, many choices, whether you go to work or learning and so on. all of these decisions need to be underpinned by information, which gives you some idea about what might happen if you make some of these choices. So, if we now move on, one of the things that I think is most kind of common way that we make labour market information available to young people is through a careers resource centre. And so we've got a fairly traditional sort of career resource centre depicted in this picture. And what it shows is that we've got a mix of online resources, space for people to work, opportunities to access leaflets and information that have been provided by the source. And I think it's really important that all schools and colleges establish some kind of careers resource centre. So this is perhaps a bit more of a modern or up-to-date kind of resource centre, which is more typically involved in giving people access to IT to enable them to access information that's been collected together. But however you organise your career resource centre, whether it's largely an online provision or whether it's a face-to-face paper and folders kind of operation, there are a number of key features. So the first thing is that however you do it, it needs to be accessible to your students, and ideally, as we'll come on to later, it would be also accessible to their parents and other key supporters. The next thing is that it needs to be comprehensive. So you need to be thinking about all of the possible careers and questions that people might have. And so it really is not good enough just to have information on a handful of careers that perhaps are careers that you can pursue with the kinds of employers who tend to produce large amounts of information. And the same would be true of universities or apprenticeship providers, is that we shouldn't just be providing young people with information about one of these routes. We need to be providing information about all of these routes. So it needs to be accessible, comprehensive, and then finally up to date. It's very important that careers information is up to date, particularly in terms of course information. We can see that many schools, colleges, universities change their course offering annually, and so it's important that we have the most up-to-date versions, and that's often helped by having materials online. So these are some principles that might underpin it. I think increasingly people are viewing their careers website or their school's website as being particularly at the core of any careers resource centre that they're organising. So the physical careers resource centre is increasingly integrated with the school website, and the website then becomes the place where resources are curated. So we might have lists of links to universities or to search sites, information about different search engines that we might want to offer to young people. So, for example, directing them towards reliable job sites or course search sites. And so that in that kind of environment where many of the resources are actually provided online rather than in paper form, the physical space then offers young people the opportunity to access these resources in a mediated way. So what I mean by that is that we generally try and help people to access the labour market information by having someone there who can support them in thinking about that. So if you're a careers leader, that might mean that you want to work with perhaps your librarian or with learning support officers who are based in the Careers Resource Centre to train them to be able to answer some of the queries that students might have when they're thinking about their career and accessing labour market information. But this idea of a level of self-access, of the ability to be able to spend some time on your own researching and finding out about careers is very important, and it's one of the things that the Careers Resource Centre can really offer. So that's, I think, perhaps the centre of your offer as a career and labour market information is establishing that kind of Careers Resource Centre. But we'll then move on to thinking about how this embeds into the curriculum. And so obviously one of the things that we would like to see is that many subjects, start to draw on labour market information and include it as part of their teaching. So, for example, if we're discussing, say, the theatre in an English lesson, we might highlight the kinds of job opportunities that are available, the kinds of courses that are available for those people who are interested in the theatre, and so on. But there's another very important activity that needs to happen in curriculum, which is the teaching of careers research skills. And there are many different ways that this can happen. But I think one of the things that we're all very attuned to now, and students also will be very attuned to, is this idea of fake news that we hear Donald Trump and many others talk about a lot. And here we've got a nice example of fake news with Hillary Clinton. And so we need to think about how we teach young people to be critical of the information that they find, particularly information they find online, and particularly information they find around their careers. So, for example, many courses will make great claims about what jobs might lead from those courses or what opportunities these courses might open. I think I've lost count of the number of UK universities that claim to be the best for employability. And we have to keep an eye on these things and look at what they're actually telling you and what it's based on. So this, I think, then takes us into a basic sort of approach that we might want to teach to young people. And this is a kind of an information research process that I think it can be very useful to teach students and then to get them to try out with looking at labour market information. So the first question is, what do I need to find out? So that doesn't start from labour market information. That starts from what the need is. So perhaps I'm interested in a career in the law, so I might want to find out what qualifications do I need in the law, or perhaps I might want to find out what does a lawyer earn, and so on. And then we think, well, where could I go for this information? And we come up with various sources and we explore, and we get students to be critical of some of those sources by thinking about who's producing them. How do I get the information that I need out of those sources? So what kind of opportunities have I get to gather this information? Which sources will provide me with accurate and reliable information? So we're then asking some of these more critical questions and then reviewing, have I got the information that I need? And so if we start to get students to work through processes of a series of questions where they start to think about what is it they're finding, what sources are available, which of those sources are useful, do those sources satisfy their information needs, and so on. We start to build a process which can actually enable them to be self-serving, be able to manage their own information needs. And I think that's one of the most important things that comes out of labour market information, is the idea that we learn to be good and critical consumers of labour market information. And so our job as careers leaders and as other people working on careers in schools is absolutely partly to put information in front of young people, and it's also to help them make sense of it. But I think even more important than that is to help them to understand the sources that are out there and to think about how they can engage with those critically. So we'll move on now to think about how we might involve parents briefly. So one of the things that I think people find most difficult about the Gatsby benchmarks is that in this benchmark 2, one of the things it talks about is how you've got to get parents involved. And that makes absolutely very good sense. Many young people are not ready to think about a lot of these kind of issues. And while our careers education should be trying to get them ready, their parents are often very interested in this. Will this course or this collection of GCSEs or A levels lead them to a good job or a good future? And parents often feel quite excluded from some of this decision making. And so there are a number of techniques that I've seen used by schools and colleges that can help to involve parents. So the first one is very basic, just producing some kind of options pack, booklet, web page, and so on, to send to parents and say, your child is about to make some important decisions. These are some of the things that you might want to think about. This is some information that you might want to read and you might want to look at. That can be reinforced by emailing parents and perhaps giving them access to key websites and talking to them again about some of the things that they might want to be interested in. We can also turn this into a kind of an activity, so we can get students to interview or to involve their parents in asking about their decisions. So, for example, a good project to do is to get students to ask their own parents, what subjects did you do when you were at school? Why did you choose those? Do you wish you'd chosen any other ones? Having some basic conversations like that can be very interesting for young people, and also provide a hook that allows allows parents to get involved in the career decision making that their children are doing. We can also include careers content at parents' evenings. That's a very good way to do it. Parents are coming in already to talk to teachers. Being able to give them access to a careers advisor or someone else who can talk to them about careers is very useful. And then finally, we've seen some schools trying to go a bit further than that and running information sessions or even short courses for parents in the evening. So, for example, choosing a university course or finding out about apprenticeships might be good information sessions that parents would be interested in coming into the school to learn a bit more about. And what we know is that parents are very important allies for young people in their career decision making, and they have a very large stake in their children's career decision making. So it's really important if you can bring them on board with you. So we're going to finish by looking at a few resources that might help you. I've just identified a few what I think are very helpful sources of career and labour market information. So the I Could site combines labour market information, statistical labour market information with videos and stories. I think that's very powerful. The National Careers Service is a very up-to-date and relevant website. NOMIS is perhaps if you want to go to the next level. That includes information on local labour markets at a very local level. So it's a very useful statistical source of statistical kinds of information. As is the Office of National Statistics, which tends to have more national types of information in there. And then, although it's a tool that's really aimed at higher education, the Prospects website is very useful and has lots of occupational profiles. So what jobs are involved in different occupations and qualifications and so on. So that's another very useful source of mainstream career and labour market information. I'll also talk you through quickly some interesting alternative sources, because I think when you start to talk about information, it starts to open up some very interesting discussions with young people. And here's some other sources of information that you might want to use. So Corporate Watch looks at how different companies and corporations behave, what their labour rights are like, what their environmental behaviour is like, and so on. And this can open up some different kinds of conversations with young people about what sort of organisations they want to work for. The Guardian Careers website is a very useful one, has lots of different kinds of content on there, including both sort of more political, newsy kind of stuff, as well as some just very practical, helpful information about different career routes. There's a very useful campaign called the Living Wage campaign, and that publishes information about employers who pay a living wage for their lowest paid employees, and that can be a very interesting thing for people to look at in terms of thinking about what companies you might want to work for, but also in terms of thinking about some of the ethics of employment. The Resolution Foundation is another similar sort of site which focuses on the intergenerational inequalities that exist. So it's a campaign really which looks at how young people are faring in the labour market, and I think it's very interesting for young people to think about how they may be treated as young people when they go into the labour market. And finally, we've got the Trade Union Congress blogs, which are very useful sources of labour market information, in general, but also raise issues around trade unions and so on as being an important player in the labour market. So there's some various resources. I've already mentioned the Careers Leader Handbook that all of this content really comes from. We really hope that you enjoy it. We also have made available through Trotman a free starter pack for careers leaders. So if you haven't got that yet, then sign up and you'll get that free starter pack. And we've also launched a Careers Leader Handbook website, which includes lots of tools and resources for you to use. And I think particularly in the light of this session, it includes lots of links to other websites that are very helpful for you. And labour market information is perhaps one of the areas where you're most dependent on other people keeping up-to-date information for you. Our next webinar is on the 17th of October. I'll be doing it again, and it will look at that Gatsby Benchmark 3, which is one of the, I would say, one of the more tricky ones. It covers a couple of different areas, so we're going to be looking at that next week. And you can sign up to that if you haven't done so already from the webinar series site. And I'll also be, if you'd like to kind of actually spend some time in person with other careers leaders and with myself and David, then you can come to one of the master classes that we're running. There's one in 15th of November in London and one on the 20th of November in York, and you can book there from a variety of different places, but from my blog is a good place to find that information. So there's a few references that I've used in this webinar, and you're welcome to use them. I also will make the resources available on my blog. In fact, I've already posted these slides, and we'll be posting a recording of this very soon afterwards. So to summarize, I think Benchmark 2 provides really a critical underpinning for students' career learning. You can't learn about career without having strong information about career. And so as a careers leader, you need to be finding useful information, passing it on to your students and their parents, and then encouraging criticality in the use of this information. And I think as a careers leader, you should see yourself as the head curator of career and labour market information for your school or college. But that doesn't mean that you have to be providing it all. And so you should be working closely with librarians, with teachers, with learning support officers and various other people to make sure that everybody is trying to make use of labour market information in their teaching and in their course. So this is my contact details. You can get these slides, as I say, from my blog, which is called Adventures in Career Development. They'll also be available through the Trotman site as well, and that's how you can contact me by email or on Twitter. So thank you for listening, for everybody who's come. I'm going to move on now and deal with some questions, but if you have to go, we're now about 4:30, so we've done our half hour, and I hope that some of this has been useful to you. So looking at some of the questions, somebody has asked, Karina has asked, are there current leaders in the LMI market that you recommend checking daily? Well, I don't really think labour market information is necessarily the sort of thing that I would necessarily check daily, but I think I've tried to outline a few strong sources of labour market information, and I think it's important that you build up some good sources of your own as well, and that might relate to your local labour market. So it might include information that's provided by your local enterprise partnership, for example, or information that's provided by your local radio or newspaper. But I think what you're trying to do is to generate a range of different kinds of resources which include different sorts of information and then make them available to young people. And I've given you about, I don't know, 10 or 12 different sources in this presentation. Somebody's asked about the difference between labour market information and labour market intelligence, and that's not actually a term that I use a lot, but what I think people mean by that when they make that distinction is that we can pile up lots of information, so we can get statistics and various kinds of facts and figures about the labour market, but it's only at the point that we start to try and think about what that means for somebody's career journey, that it really becomes intelligence. So if I was going to tell you that a new Tesco's has opened and there's going to be 500 new jobs, that's not really intelligence that's very useful for a young person in a school. But if you start to say to them, and so that means they'll be recruiting, 15 new apprentices next year, some of them will be in retail, some of them will be in IT, some of them will be in accountancy and so on. It starts to become something that has a more of a direct relevance to the young person. And so I think that's what people are normally referring to when they're making that distinction between just information and then actually intelligence. So intelligence is kind of mediated by a professional usually to give it more actual meaning. Okay, so some more questions here. Do we have any activities or lesson plans to teach students how to learn a research process for labour market information? Well, I tried to outline that little process that we've got, and there's a little bit more in the book that goes into that in a bit more detail. But I think one of the things that's most useful is to set students little research projects here and to get them to identify a question and then to investigate, say, a sector or an occupation. One of the things that we do in the book actually is to identify some key vocabulary that is important for people to engage into when they're thinking about labour market information, which includes things like understanding the difference between labour market information and intelligence, but also between occupations, so individual jobs, and sectors, which are the areas in which we might work. And we identify a number of other key terms, things like CV would be another term that sort of is helping to demystify the labour market. So I think going through and demystifying some of these key terms is very useful, but then actually setting students research projects, getting them to investigate a sector, report back on the sector, identify which jobs are available to young people, key qualifications that are required, that kind of thing can be very, very powerful. And thank you to Elizabeth Betts, who's highlighted the Labour Market for All widget, which you can download and embed into a school's website, which is very good. We mentioned the Labour Market for All website in the book, and it's a very helpful source, and it actually sits behind a number of the sources of information that I've already mentioned. So certainly it's behind the ICOUD website, uses the Labour Market for All information. So I think that's all the questions I've got so far. So unless there's any other questions, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and hopefully you found some of that useful. And I will look forward to seeing some of you again sort of this time next week when we'll be moving on to look at Gatsby Benchmark 3.